Vladimir Lenin is one of the most controversial characters in history. He's a silly fella who wrote some silly books and overthrew the Russian Tsar's government, creating the USSR. Nowadays, any communist dictatorship worth its salt got most of their ideas on how to go about creating a revolution and starting a communist government from Lenin. Today's book, The State and Revolution, lays the groundwork for how Lenin believes a state progresses from capitalism to socialism and then to communism, while also explaining why Lenin believes that a violent revolution is not only justified, but necessary in order to achieve a communist state. To start, I will give a general summary of each chapter with a light commentary before going into a full analysis. The first chapter acts as the foundation for the upcoming ideas. Lenin thinks that the state is cringe. The state is something which can only arise through class antagonism and is, quote, an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. This applies to all states, monarchies, republics, or democracies. All types of states are simply the means by which the bourgeoisie control the lower classes and oppress them. In fact, not only is democracy a state of oppression, it is one of the greatest states to protect capitalism. Capitalism finds itself protected by hiding under the guise of universal suffrage and pretending to give workers representation and freedom, when in reality this is all a ruse. Quote, a democratic republic is the best possible political shell for capitalism, and therefore, once capital has got control of this excellent shell, it establishes its power so securely that no change of individuals, of institutions, or of parties in the bourgeoisie democratic republic can shake this power, end quote. To Lenin, it is imperative that the working class and revolutionaries shed the idea that any state is a good one, with the state being, by Lenin's definition, a tool of the upper class to oppress the lower class. It stands to reason that the state must be removed if communism is to be obtained. But how do we go about this? With violent revolution, that's how. Whoa, baby, kill them all! To be clear, Lenin doesn't intend to get rid of the state entirely and go straight into communism. After his revolution, he means to create a new kind of state that flips the oppression. Quote, it follows from the definition that the special repressive force for the suppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie of millions of laboring people by a handful or two of the wealthy must be replaced by a special repressive force for the suppression of bourgeoisie by the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is the very nub of the eradication of the state as a state, end quote. In conjunction with oppressing the bourgeoisie, the working class must also seize the means of production. These acts will introduce the lower stage of communism, which Lenin calls socialism, or the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin closes this chapter by saying, quote, the replacement of the bourgeoisie state by the proletarian state is impossible without a violent revolution. The eradication of the proletarian state, i.e. the eradication of the state as such, is impossible except through the process of withering away. It's important to note here that the withering away of the state is what occurs as socialism moves into communism. Once socialism oppresses the rich and puts the means of production in the hands of the workers, the state shall begin to wither away as each new generation is raised and properly socialized, until the state itself withers away and leaves behind communism. Not a lot of important stuff in this chapter. Lenin basically uses it to show us that according to Marx, we need violent revolution. People who don't want revolutions are naughty little boys who are trying to undermine Marxism and are actually falling into the hands of the capitalists. Lenin says something that is neat and spicy when describing socialism. Quote, the state in this period unavoidably has to be a state that is democratic in a new way for the proletarians and the propertyless in a general, and dictatorial in a new way against the bourgeoisie. Basically, this new state will be both democratic and dictatorial and super cool and awesome. This chapter discusses a commune that emerged in Paris that honestly I know very little about, so I'll just focus on what Lenin says Marx learned from it. Basically, the creation of the Paris Commune reinforces the idea that the state must be completely smashed and cannot simply be reformed. The Commune also provides examples for how the new society should be constructed. Quote, there should be complete electivity of all officials without exception, their subjection to recall at any time, the reduction of their salaries to the level of an ordinary workman's wages. These simple and self-evident democratic measures, while completely uniting the interests of the workers and the majority of the peasants, at the same time serve as a bridge from capitalism over to socialism, end quote. We also begin to see Lenin participating in COPE. He is incredibly insistent that he isn't a utopian. His evidence for this is generally that he thinks it will take a while for communism to arrive. Quote, "We are not utopians. We do not have dreams about dispensing at once with all administration, with all subordination. These anarchist dreams, based upon a misunderstanding of the tasks of the dictatorship of the proletariat, are essentially alien to Marxism, and in practice serve only to postpone the socialist revolution until people have themselves become different." End quote. He makes this claim despite saying that communism, a world where everyone is equal and gets along, and everyone gets stuff they need, and everyone works for the fun of it, etc., is achievable and not incredibly utopian. Just because you think it will take a while to get utopia does not mean you are not a utopian. Lenin continues to bolster his case for revolution and dunking on anarchists by quoting Engels. Lenin hates everyone who disagrees with him. Since leftist infighting has been a tradition throughout all of history, we shouldn't be surprised. He is especially peeved with the anarchists. Quote, "We do not at all disagree with the anarchists on the question of the abolition of the state as an aim. We maintain that, to achieve this aim, we must make temporary use of the instruments, resources, and methods of state power against the exploiters, just as a temporary dictatorship of the oppressed class is necessary for the abolition of classes." End quote. This is the main difference between anarcho-communists and Marxist-Leninists/Tankies from what I can tell. Anarcho-communists think the state can be destroyed and communism brought about almost immediately. Tankies think a dictatorship must first exist, and then communism will come out of the state once the dictatorship withers away. Lenin points to writings by Engels to further his claim. According to Lenin, Engels supported violent revolution and is against the anarchists, saying, quote, "Revolution is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannons, i.e. extremely authoritarian means." In this quote, Engels was referring to the very act of revolution as an authoritarian one. This serves to undermine the anarchists' claims of communism being an ideology of anarchy, or an ideology that can be achieved through acts of anarchy. It seems to me that Lenin is using this quote quite effectively, as Engels does seem to be in support of the concept of communism being authoritarian. Lenin goes real deep on the withering away of the state. He rails against democracy under capitalism some more, saying, quote, "Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich. This is democratism of capitalist society." End quote. He then is once again totally not being utopian when saying, only in communist society, when the resistance of the capitalists has been definitively crushed, only then will a truly complete democracy without any exceptions whatever, will become possible and realized. And only then will democracy begin to wither away, because of the simple fact that, relieved of infamies of capitalist exploitation, people will gradually become accustomed to observing the elementary rules of social intercourse that have been known for ages and repeated for thousands of years in all copybooks, and to observing them without force, without compulsion, without subordination, without the special apparatus for compulsion, which is called the state. End quote. Guys, Lenin is not a utopian. He just thinks everyone will follow the rules of society without having to be forced to do it because they were socialized to. And then the state will disappear and everyone will hang out. It'll be mega cool and super awesome. Lenin goes into some detail, albeit not a lot, about how his socialist society will function. The socialist government will set up a fund. With this fund, they will take people's money and use it to increase productive capacity, repair machinery, and set up funds for the old and infirmed. Everyone will be given money based on how many hours they work. Lenin acknowledges that this will create inequality, but says that the creation of the state will inevitably lead to the withering away of the state itself. Quote, "The state withers away insofar as there are no longer any capitalists. There are no longer any classes, and, consequently, no class whatsoever can be suppressed." End quote. Lenin then goes on to say that, quote, "The state will be able to wither away completely when society fulfills the rule from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, i.e., when people have become so accustomed to observing the fundamental rules of social intercourse, and when their labor becomes so productive that they will voluntarily work according to their ability. End quote. The withering away will specifically happen due to the socialization that will occur under socialism. The means of production will be seized by the people, so their exploitation will cease. Once all the capitalists are oppressed in society, future generations will be socialized in a society without oppression. This socialization will create people who live for the community. They will embody duty to their fellow man and will see no reason to go back to their oppressive ways due to the ease of their new lives as the state withers away into communism. Some may call this utopian bullshit, but Lenin has a response to this. He says, quote, "From the bourgeois point of view, it is easy to declare such a social order to be sheer utopia, and to sneer at the socialists for promising everyone the right to receive from society, without any control over the labor of the individual citizen, any quantity of truffles, cars, pianos, etc. Ignorance. For it has never entered the head of a single socialist to promise that the higher phase of development of communism will arrive, but the anticipation by the great socialists that it will arrive presupposes the existence of neither the present-day productivity of labor nor the present Philistines. Basically, this society isn't a utopia because people won't be able to get everything they want in a limitless supply, and the current critics of communism will cease to exist and cease to undermine the proper socialization of the people. I'm going to stop my summary for 1 second to make something crystal clear. Lenin is a utopian, or at the very least is participating in a highly utopian thought. Just because a society doesn't have everything doesn't stop it from being utopian. Simply because communism may lack certain utopian aspects, such as unlimited luxury resources, as the aforementioned truffles, does not preclude the communist society that Lenin does describe from being utopian. The most glaringly obvious example of this is Lenin's claim that under communism there will be no state, no police, and no military apparatus, but everyone will follow generally accepted rules and live in relative harmony. This is a utopian notion. The idea that everyone will simply live together peacefully without a state or governing body is simply absurd. I reject the notion that proper socialization would create this perfectly enlightened group of people, and I reject the notion that such a socialization, one in which everyone is in perfect agreement and harmony, is possible. So while communism, as described by Lenin, is not perfect in all ways, and therefore isn't what some might consider a pure utopia, the society he does describe suffers from so much utopianism that it is impossible and as ridiculous as a pure utopia. Also, capitalism has made running the state super easy, according to Lenin. Quote, "The accounting and control in this respect have been simplified by capitalism to the extreme and reduced to the extraordinarily simple operations which any literate person can perform, of supervising and recording, of knowing the basic rules of arithmetic, and of issuing the appropriate receipts." Again, this is utopian, or painfully naive. It's a totally unrealistic and implausible assessment of reality by Lenin. In this chapter, Lenin complains about other Marxists. Not super important because I've been sparing you the constant complaining Lenin does throughout this book, but he dedicates pages upon pages to complaining about different Marxists that were around during his time, because leftists just can't get along. They all have slightly different ideas, so instead of working together for a common goal, they instead have to kill each other. This book is dumb, and I don't like it. As already stated, Lenin is 100% a utopian. A utopian view of his is that with the proper setup, the socialist state will simply disappear over time and bring about a communist state. I do not believe that this is correct, and I think this is evidenced by the failure for the USSR, China, North Korea, Vietnam, or any other socialist state to collapse into a communist state. The withering away of the state is predicated on the idea that people will be properly socialized under socialism. But how exactly would that be accomplished? The way that this is accomplished becomes very clear. Re-education camps. These kinds of camps have been common in all socialist states from the USSR to China to Vietnam. Every socialist state forces re-education on everyone who doesn't blindly follow them. This kind of socialization would necessitate the ending of various liberties. Freedom of speech, expression, right to protest, and so on would all be curtailed so as not to poison the socialist state's socialization. Any attempts to undermine the dictatorship of the proletariat's plans at socialization is a direct threat towards achieving the dream of communism and would need to be stomped out. These are the methods that would be needed to achieve such socialization, but as stated previously, I reject the idea that such kinds of socialization is even possible, no matter what methods are used. Now let's discuss what it means to oppress the bourgeoisie. It's a very interesting word, and it poses a problem. One of Lenin's claims is that by creating a state with no class oppression, a communist state can arise, but the socialist state that shall be around before communism requires us to oppress a whole group of people, those being the bourgeoisie. So doesn't that mean those living in the socialist state will be raised in a situation in which there is oppression? And therefore communism will never come, because communism can only arrive once we have reached a post-oppression society? Well, what's actually happening is Lenin is simply using a euphemism. Oppression just means we kill them. Can't oppress people if they're dead. Or we would just send them to a gulag to be used as slave labor, far away from the proletariat, so that way the proletariat does not see all the oppression that's occurring and are tricked into thinking they're living in a society without oppression. This is the only way to get around this concept of oppression. If it is necessary that no oppression be around for communism to come about, then you can't simply keep oppressing their oppressors. You just kill them. You send them to gulags and you end them. That is the only way to then achieve this communist state. The socialist state that Lenin describes is poorly thought out. The most glaring issue is that Lenin claims that capitalism has made running all of society simple and easy. This is clearly untrue. If it were true, bureaucracies would be infinitely smaller, and frankly, socialist states would have a competitive advantage against capitalist ones due to increased efficiency. One of the great failures of socialist economics, or command economies, is how highly inefficient they are. Lenin's ideas of giving out tokens based purely on labor and pricing goods based purely on labor hours creates problems for the elasticity of prices. For example, if an item takes only 1 hour of labor to make, but is rare and sought after, this will cause a rush on the market, and the item will quickly be purchased and run out of stock. This creates a perverse incentive structure where the people who originally bought it now sell it on the black market for huge markups to meet the demand. Let's say the scalpers sell it back to the people for 8 hours of labor tokens, and everyone is now forced to pay at this price. In a capitalist market, this is solved by simply increasing prices and reacting to demand. Under socialism, this practice is made illegal and a black market immediately forms. Then police must come in and break up the black market, which creates a greater burden on the state and therefore the taxpayer. A problem that is easily and efficiently solved under capitalism spirals into a costly and ineffective issue under socialism. Other issues like this arise out of labor tokens, but even if such tokens were done away with in favor of paper money and paying people more based on the demand of their labor and not the hours worked, there would still be inefficiency of pricing, as a socialist bureaucracy and government is much slower to react to market forces when compared to capitalist societies. Now, is there anything I agree with Lenin on? Well, it seems to me that Marx and Engels do agree with Lenin to an extent. They certainly seem to agree with him on the necessity of both a violent revolution and the creation of a socialist state ruled by the dictatorship of the proletariat. They might disagree on the particularities of that state when compared with Lenin's ideas, but I'm going to be honest, I have read very little of what Marx and Engels has written, so I don't know the exact particularities on which they may disagree, but Lenin makes a seemingly strong case that Marx and Engels would be on his side. That is it. That is all I agree with. Socialism and communism, as laid out by Lenin, are stupid. Lenin demands the immediate ending of your rights, the destruction of your democracy, and the execution of literally millions. An example being, if we had a revolution in the US and killed only the top 1%, there'd be a minimum of 3 million people dead. To support Lenin and his ideas is to cheer and hope for an oppressive regime to kill and oppress millions for a communist society that will never come. This book is bad. 1 out of 10.